Mr. Hutchins says this, quote, "In the tabernacle, the brethren, clothed in black, mourn Osiris, who is representative of the sun, of light, of life, of good and beauty. They reflect upon the way the earth may again be gladdened by his presence," unquote. Mr. Pike connected the sun to Osiris, mentioned by Mr. Hutchins as worthy of being mourned. Quote, "The three lights at the altar inside the Masonic temple represent Osiris, Isis, and Horus. Osiris was represented by the sun," unquote. Mr. Mackey went a little further and informed his readers that, quote, "Osiris was the sun," unquote. In his book entitled Introduction to Freemasonry, Carl H. Cloudy, the author, himself a Mason, connected the sun worship with the ceremonies inside the Masonic Lodge. Quote, "The lodge sets him," meaning the initiate, "upon the path that leads to light, but it is for him to travel the winding path to the symbolic east," unquote. The physical sun rises in the east, and the Masons explain that their search for light begins in the east. And notice that Mr. Cloudy capitalizes the word east, apparently in reverence to the spot where they believe that this God resides. The Masons tell the world that they circumambulate, defined as walking around the temple floor during their initiation ceremonies. Mr. Cloudy explains why this rite is performed. Quote, "When the candidate first circles the lodge room about the altar, he walks step by step with 1,000 shades of men who have thus worshipped the Most High by humble imitation. Thus thought of circumambulation is no longer a mere parade, but a ceremony of significance, linking all who take part in it with the spiritual aspirations of a dim and distant past," unquote. And it is a historical fact that the Knights Templar also performed the circumambulation of their temples. And he further instructs his readers as to why this ceremony is part of their ceremony. Quote, "Early man circled altars on which burned the fire which was his god, from east to west by way of the south. Notice that the north is not included in the ceremony. The significance of that omission will be discussed later. But circumambulation became a part of all religious observances," unquote. In another part of his book, entitled Introduction to Freemasonry, Mr. Cloudy reported that this style of walking was traceable to the ancient religions of the past. And he wrote this, quote, "Circumambulation was the ceremonies of ancient Egypt," unquote. So this practice of the modern Masons is based upon the ancient pagan religious practices of the ancients. So the Masons are telling us that early man walked around in a circle because he was worshiping the sun. Then they tell us that they are doing it for the same reason. There are reasons that the north, as a location to be visited in their walk around the temple floor, is not included in their initiation rites, and 6 of the great Masonic writers have told us why this is so. Captain William Morgan offered his readers this explanation with this comment from his book, the writing of which he was murdered for. Quote, "We therefore Masonically term the north a place of darkness," unquote. Mr. Mackey confirmed that statement in his book. Quote, "The north is Masonically called a place of darkness." What the symbol of the north represents will be explored later. And the 6th Masonic writer who confirmed that the north was a place of darkness was Carl Cloudy, who wrote in his book entitled Introduction to Freemasonry, quote, "The place of darkness, the north," unquote. And the reason the Masons do not include the north in their rites is found in the Bible. In the Bible. The reason the Masons do not include the north in their rites is found in the Bible, in Isaiah chapter 14, verse 13. Quote, "I," meaning Lucifer, "will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north," unquote. The God of the Bible sits in the north, and Lucifer hopes one day to acquire the throne of God for his throne. But until then, the north is a place of darkness. But while the north is an excluded territory, the east is the place of light and is to be revered. Mr. Hutchins tells his readers why that is so. Quote, the east, the source of light and thus knowledge, unquote. Albert Mackey quotes Etienne Francois Bazat, a French Masonic writer, in his encyclopedia. Quote, the veneration which the Masons have for the East bears a relation to the primitive religion whose first degeneration was sun worship, unquote. Rex Hutchins then tells his readers that the Masons deploy lights around the lodge room during the initiation ceremony for the 25th degree, called the Night of the Sun, and he writes, quote, the ceiling should be decorated to represent the heavens with the moon, the principal planets and the constellations Taurus and Orion. A single powerful light, a great globe of glass representing the sun, is in the south. In a physical sense, the greater light comes from the sun, and the transparencies provide lesser light. Symbolically, the sun, or great light, is the truth, and the lesser lights are man's symbolic representation of truth, unquote. Mr. Mackey further discusses this rite of circumambulation, as he calls it, in his encyclopedia. He says that the rite, quote, exists in Freemasonry. The people always walked 3 times round the altar while singing a sacred hymn. In making this procession, great care was taken to move in imitation of the course of the sun, unquote. He then assisted the reader with understanding this practice in the Masonic temples. Quote, this rite of circumambulation undoubtedly refers to the doctrine of sun worship, unquote. However, in another of the books that he wrote, Mr. Mackey directly states that the rite is connected to sun worship. This is what he wrote in a book entitled Manual of the Lodge. Quote, the circumambulation among the pagan nations referred to the great doctrines of Sabaism or sun worship, unquote. Sabaism is defined by Mr. Mackey in his encyclopedia as, quote, Sabaism, the worship of the sun, moon, and stars, the host of heaven. It was practiced in Persia, Chaldea, India, and other Oriental countries at an early period in the world's history, unquote. He then added this rather cryptic comment, quote, and although the dogma of sun worship does not, of course, exist in Freemasonry, we find an allusion to it in the rite of circumambulation, which it preserves, unquote.
These drugs greatly induced a sort of a contemplative approach to life. The thought that some kid could drop acid and see God and find peace and calm and be a happy person, and this thought is does away with every institutional approach to right living that there is.
That's what makes LSD so lethal, is that anyone with 350 micrograms of acid inside of their blood, changing their chemicals, can sit there and feel the universe roll in and out of them. Grandeur, the majesty of being, which is celestial.